All right, so let me go ahead and share screen here. So with that, a couple of disclaimers for this group. This group's not going to guarantee that you get to pass the CRC examination. You're not going to get the answers, but you're going to build on your test taking strategies as well as expand upon your knowledge. So when you are ready to take the CRC, you have enough information to pass, because that's the end goal. It's not to ace it, it's enough information to pass it. With that, of course, we are all professionals in here, whether we're students, whether we've been tenured working, or trying to get into a related field. We are all professionals here, so please be professional. With that, the materials and stuff that we talk about, which of course goes back to that red book, is not endorsed. I'm not getting paid to sell that book out. I'm not being sponsored by anybody. And no, I don't think anybody in here is being sponsored. So the book is for itself, but this is what we're using to study to it because it is very helpful. With that, we will not pay for your exam. We will not pay for your own books or supplies that you need. If you want to contribute something, you're more than welcome to it. I'm definitely, as you can tell, I'm happily contribute my resources. And because I feel like having an open database resource to help you study is going to help you pass. With that too, this group is not representing any major organizations. Although I go to the University of Texas out of Paso, I am not representing UTEP. I'm representing me, myself. With that, nothing here is mandatory, but I will ask for your help. And what I mean by that is I may ask a couple of you if you want to volunteer some time. We have most of the slides done from January, so it may just be help lecturing or providing subject matter expertise in those specific areas of studies. We have subject matter experts in here in specific fields, so please, 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 please chime in. So just as a little couple of reminders here, we already voted on the success rate for, not success rate, we voted on the dates and times that we're going to meet for CRC, and that's the times I'm going to stick with. So I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to edit and update it. I'm sticking and staying committed with it. So just so like that, you have this down here and we have it on the recording. Let me go to the forms. Based on the results, based on 22 results, can everybody see this? Everybody agreed to do Thursdays and Sundays. Thursdays will be the same time, 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time is my time sharp. Sundays is going to be in the mornings. That's the majority rule. So that's quiz time. So Thursday evenings, Sunday mornings. Now I know Easter's coming up, so I understand if you cannot make it. I understand for based on religious or personal preferences. So I will open it on Sunday, but if I don't have anybody here, I'm going to close within 15-20 minutes. But if there is a lot of people that show up, then we'll host a study group. If not, the following week we'll stay committed between Thursdays evenings and Sunday mornings. Keep in mind, only Thursday lectures are recorded. Sundays are not recorded because we do test taking strategies. Okay. With that, we may use some questions that are similar to CRC. And what I don't want is getting in trouble or being liable in case you say, oh, you took that from the CRC exam. How did you know? We don't want that. So. All right. So the first section we're going to talk on, this is, I give the very first lecture for here. This is about professional orientation and ethics. That's going to be the first big section that we're going to discuss here. And then following the next few weeks, we're going to go down these modules. I will at some point switch though to maybe do research methodology and performance management midway, right before we get into assessment, because I think we need to switch that around a little bit. I'll explain that later. So with that, welcome back. If you're returning, welcome back. I've only been waiting for you for so long. So, welcome, Cassandra. Welcome, everybody. So with that, basically, when we talk about the professional ethics, these are things that whether you're a mental health counselor, clinical rehabilitation specialist, a professor, we all have an ethics to adhere to. So a lot of stuff may sound a little redundant on some of the things, and other stuff is maybe some new information to you. Now, the first bit's a little cut and dry because it's either you know it or you don't. And what I mean by that is when you take the CRC exam, you don't get to really, for this type of questions that you may see or answers you may see, you can do a deduction, But really, you have to learn it. You have to know the material. You have to know what the Rehab Act of 1973 is. You have to know the Smith-Vest Act. You have to know those. So we'll talk about that. So with that, let me get started here. Let's see, I'm gonna make this smaller. There we go. So to first start off here, the oldest and most successful public program supporting employment and independence for individuals with disabilities was the vocational rehab program. VR has been out since 1917, just wasn't called that until about 1918 and 1935. But it was vocational, and later on became rehabilitation. And with that, it's been here nearly a century. So vocational rehab does have a history in the federal service field. So this never came up through private, this never came up through state, this started through the federal agencies. Okay. And I encourage you on your own to study the Smith-Hughes Act, Soldiers Rehabilitation Act, and Smith-Vest Act, and the Social Security Act 1935, because those are going to be important. So with that, I don't want to talk too much on here because I actually have a good video. And yes, I did find one for somebody who's hearing impaired. And I also have one. This is a good study tool just to recap on all the rehabilitation acts. And then this is the one we're going to see that comes from, I think it's Wyoming, Wisconsin. We'll open it up here. Okay. And everybody hear that?
You're not fat. It's the shirt.
Looking. Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm going to make this bigger. And then I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my camera. My computer will cooperate. And then for bandwidth, and I'm going to go ahead and skip the ad and we're going to watch this.
The public rehabilitation program in America can trace its roots back to World War I. During that war, modern medicine allowed more injured soldiers to survive and come home with significant disabilities than ever before, but they couldn't go back to their old jobs. The Soldiers Rehabilitation Act of 1918 introduced a new concept in disability support, not just money to live on, but training for the injured veterans as preparation for new jobs matching their new abilities. A farmer who lost a leg fighting in France might be trained in drafting. A factory worker with lungs burned by chlorine gas might become a pharmacist. This idea was popular with the American people and matched programs in several states for training injured workers. In 1920, Congress expanded the Veterans Program to include anyone with a physical disability, not just veterans. This was the beginning of the Public Vocational Rehabilitation Program, or VR. The new program was great as long as your physical disability met the requirements and as long as you needed the limited VR services the system offered. These gentlemen, for instance, are learning to weave wicker backs and seats for chairs. These men are making rugs. But if you had some other kind of disability that didn't meet the requirements, such as seizures or mental retardation, you weren't eligible for any help. People with these disorders continued to live on charity from family, church groups, or strangers, or in a state-supported institution. World War II expanded the rehabilitation system even more. When millions of soldiers went off to war, they left behind jobs that still needed to be done. So millions of women went to work to help out, but many unskilled jobs were still empty. To help fill those jobs, some amendments to the Rehab Act in 1943 expanded VR services to include people with mental illness and mental retardation. This gradually doubled the number of people finding jobs through VR, and those new workers began changing society's stereotypes about what people with disabilities could do. In response to comments from the public, these amendments also changed the kinds of services that VR provided. In addition to training and guidance, VR began paying to correct certain disabilities, including cataract surgery on eyes or bone surgery for limb deformities. VR also began paying for equipment like hearing aids or wheelchairs, anything that improved the ability of someone with a disability to find a job. The 1943 amendments also allowed states to create separate VR agencies for people with blindness, if the states chose to. In the decades that followed, as the economy grew and as doctors learned how to treat more serious disabilities, the process of VR became more complicated. Beginning with the 1954 amendments to the Act, the federal government started funding scientific research into disabilities and rehabilitation, eventually leading to the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDR. These amendments also significantly increased funding for the public rehabilitation system to match its growing popularity. Politically, vocational rehabilitation was popular. It helped thousands of people, even if it still didn't reach everyone with a disability. It had a clear definition of its target group, people with disabilities who could return to work with help, and a clear definition of success, employment of those people. You could measure the results financially, and the program consistently made money for the government. On average, for every dollar spent on training and support initially, people with disabilities paid $7 in state and federal taxes when they got back to work. VR was a Washington success story. Then came the 1965 amendments. President Johnson used these to recruit VR into his Great Society program. VR had been so successful finding jobs for people in need, so to speak, that the administration was going to expand its role. Suddenly, the term disability included drug abuse, alcoholism, repeated jail sentences, so-called behavior disorders, public assistance, and many other conditions that were not medical at all. In short, almost anyone who couldn't get a job could get help from VR. VR was operating offices in prisons, welfare offices, and storefronts. Where the VR system had once served thousands of people, it now served tens of thousands. This change quickly overwhelmed the system, and VR officials had to streamline the process. Now applicants were processed and evaluated quickly, and training choices were much more limited. VR services became less individualized and flexible, and rehabilitation became a mass production system. VR now helped many more people, but the people who needed the flexibility and individualization of earlier years, people with the most significant disabilities, often got lost in the shuffle. They had to go back to doing without. By this time, in late 60s and 70s, people with disabilities, advocates, and family members had learned a few lessons from the civil rights movement. They began lobbying and protesting about, among other things, this streamlining of VR. In 1973, Congress responded with a completely new Rehab Act. This act directed VR to primarily serve people with significant physical or mental disabilities. In addition, counselors and consumers would now work in close partnership to individualize services, and each counselor-consumer team would use a formal, individualized written rehabilitation program to help them develop and carry out those services. Meanwhile, the voices of disability advocates continued to grow. They started a radical deinstitutionalization movement in the 1960s, which pushed institutions to move people out into new group homes and residential care facilities in local communities. Unfortunately, after lifetimes living passively in institutions, many people living in the new facilities didn't know what else to do. Instead of creating community inclusion, many group homes became small duplicates of the institutions. Although the new facilities were a good idea, it was going to take more than that for people with disabilities to build ties to their communities and live independently. Out of these efforts and others came a new disability rights movement. Advocates began to talk about things like community inclusion and consumer choice for disability services. The VR system integrated these concepts with new amendments in 1986. For people with the most significant disabilities, these amendments shifted VR's focus away from jobs in protected places like sheltered workshops. Instead, the amendments provided supports to help people adapt to work in typical jobs out in the community. Since 1986, VR has continued working closely with the disability community and has integrated emerging concepts into its regulations and services. In 1992, new amendments to the Rehab Act created a new front section that spelled out some of these concepts in a statement of definitions and principles. These amendments also created the state rehabilitation councils, which are citizens' advisory councils in each state to increase the voice of consumers in the policy and operations of state agencies. In addition, the 1992 amendments increased the role of the consumer in planning his or her services, mandated a set of standards and indicators for monitoring agencies, required agencies to set minimum training standards for all VR counselors, and speeded up the eligibility process. The amendments also said agencies were to presume that everyone with a disability could benefit from VR services. This meant agencies could not deny services to someone just because his or her disability was very significant. In 1998, another set of amendments increased supports for informed consumer choice in the VR process, streamlined some administrative requirements, and increased the options to help consumers find high-quality jobs. This set of amendments also required a partnership between the public rehabilitation system and other state and federal agencies that provide employment-related services. This included requirements for local cooperative agreements. As part of this partnering effort, the Rehab Act became Title IV of the Workforce Investment Act. However, the changes carefully maintain the integrity of the public rehabilitation system. The VR system still provides flexible, individualized services to people with disabilities who need more than the general public jobs programs can provide. Through all these changes, the guiding principles of the rehabilitation system have not changed. A belief that employment and productivity lead to independence, and a belief that independence is the right of all American citizens.
Well, as you are aware, there's a lot more acts than that now. I mean, that's a little outdated, but the key thing here is that we wouldn't be where we're at today, and rehab wouldn't exist today without our laws governing what we can and cannot do, and of course for disability rights. So with that, I'm also going to go ahead and copy and paste these extra links, and I will upload these new slides later. So like that, you can use them. The second link is, no, that didn't work. Hold on. Okay. There we go. Let's try this here. There we go. That one is the same thing, but it has more information for the study guide. And then for those who are either deaf or hard in hearing, I was lucky enough to find this for you. So that's for yours as well. So if you have anybody who is deaf or hard of hearing, you can send them that third link for sharing for the History Act. So moving on forward here. Everything started off, as mentioned in the video, with the Smith-Hughes Act in 1972. And on the CRC, you might get a question that asks you about the Smith-Hughes Act or what was the first act regarding voting for vocational education, vocational training. It was this one. Right after that came the Soldiers Rehabilitation Act of 1917 or 1918, okay, which is services for World War I veterans. And even today, we're still servicing military service members. And the Red Book, and I'll show you here in a minute with the Red Book how they table it. But one of the things I do want to mention is that a good strategy that you could use to do this is timeline this. So as you're studying the other stuff between here, looking at the counseling theories and also looking at disabilities, if you timeline it, it'll be easier for you to comprehend. So for instance, I can give you an example. I want to say anything prior to 1946 or 1954, if I'm not mistaken. Prior to that, mental health wasn't really included because guess what was happening during those times? Sigmund Freud hadn't started yet. Psychology was a barely new emerging thing, so you wouldn't see those prior to certain dates. That's just one example that you can use. With that, though, you can also simplify this too. Of course, Smith-Fest Act 1920 was for civilians. So you can do Smith-Hughes Act 1917, the start of vocational rehab, 18 for soldiers. These are federal. This became open to civilians. And then Social Security made the VR program permanent. Okay. With that, you might get asked about other stuff too. I think I saw a question related to the Randolph-Shepard Act about people who are blind to sell in a federal building or to authorize or enforce federal agencies to purchase stuff from people who are blind, which it comes after. And you have the Wagner-O Day, requiring government agencies to purchase certain products. And here we go, the Barton-Laffolek Act. Expand services to people with mental disabilities. That's what I was talking about. And of course, establish state federal programs and purchase stuff from people who are blind. Okay. So you're probably thinking, well, which is the most important ones to remember? I would say the most important ones to remember are going to be your first few here: the Social Security Act of 1935, Rehabilitation Act of 1954, Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the ADA Act. And it's not just understanding the acts, it's understanding the details that are in them. Any questions, thoughts, concerns, or observations so far that anybody would like to chime in? No? All right. So, Vocational Rehab Act of 1965 extended the VR process up to 18 months. This, if you see, you can see a question that we'll talk about, well, how does this work? It's basically to increase $3 of federal funding for each state dollar. So for every time the state provides services, the federal will have to increase that or meet it. And of course, eliminate the original need for services, introduce the services for people with clinically diagnosed behavioral disorders. Okay, what that means is, going back here to Barton-Laffolek Act, we didn't really understand about mental disabilities. If some of you go back to your times of counseling, or if you're a mental health counselor, you would know that prior to the field of psychology, mental health was seen as a moral issue. People looked down on it, thinking that something's wrong with you and you're morally wrong. Now we understand there's a lot more that goes to the mind than just a moral issue. There's a lot of behavior, psychiatrics, neurological, and so forth. But prior to that, anybody with mental health issue or was deemed to have mental health issue wouldn't have received VR services. So I'm emphasizing that because when you timeline these, you realize first it was just injured workers, then blindness and mental health, and then so forth and so forth. Okay. So now, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, I want to focus more on this one here. It prioritizes people with the most severe disabilities. So if you're working at a state VR agency or a federal VR agency and you refer somebody to VR services, my guess here is that the intake manager is going to prioritize whoever's receiving the referrals who has the most severe disabilities to receive those services first before somebody with a less severe disability. That's why sometimes there's a delay on people receiving VR services. But that's because of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that is still applicable today. Also establishes something called the Individualized Written Rehabilitation Plan, or as we know it today, the Individual Plan of Employment or Individual Employment Plan, IEP. Okay. And we'll talk about that here when we go down to the slides. Of course, they implement the thing called the Client Assistance Program, or CAPS, to receive assistance and advocacy, establish demonstration projects and independent living and rehab services. So I want to say in the 70s, there was an institution dedicated for creating tools, assistive devices, and stuff like that for engineering for people with disabilities. And now it's called something else. And I believe we'll talk about that further in the slides. Not only that, it also increased, there we go, this is what I was talking about. It increased the funding for rehabilitation disability research and created the National Institute of Handicap Research. I want to say it's called something else, but don't quote me on that. It's on the Red Book. So now, the key things that I would recommend, and I saw this on the CRC exam, and several predecessors also saw this on the CRC exam, is make sure you know what the Section 501 through 4 is for the 1973 Act. How I memorized it was affirmative action, federal hiring. 501 is affirmative action. 503 is affirmative action. 502 is enforcement. 504 is equal. So for me, I'm like, I know there's two affirmative actions, which is federal agencies must hire people with disabilities. That's 7% rule. And if a company is receiving a federal contract, they must hire, of course, people with disabilities and make sure that they're serving a certain amount of people with disabilities. Of course, 502 was enforce the accessibility standard for federal buildings and of course, equal opportunities. If you were listening in that video, and if you were listening to Judy Human, although these acts came out for what they were talking about, they weren't enforced. They were not enforced until a bit later when we had the 88 acts that kind of, I would say, reciprocated this. So this is like the starting of it. The other stuff was the enforcing of it. With that too, other noticeable rehabilitation acts, and these were like amendments. So this now is getting posted through the mandated provision independent living rehabilitation services, mandated state to have a client assistance program, prison engineering service and rehabilitation. I want to look up something here real quick to give you something to think about. And I do have a question I'm going to ask everybody here so we can have a discussion on. When did the institutionalization? In the United States. I used to have a link for this. I couldn't find it. Hold on. I want you to think about something, okay? Those acts that we talked about up to 1973. Prior to that, if you were considered at the time, they called it mentally retarded or had autism, you had Down syndrome, you had some weird deficiency, you had a mental health disorder, most of the time, a family would send them to an institution, a state-based institution to receive services, and those were not that good. In 1963, there was a big movement to deinstitutionalize people with mental health and other disabilities. And I'm sharing that with you to get a bigger picture because from 1960s to 70s, we start seeing the Rehabilitation Amendments Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. These things are starting to come into play now. And we're seeing all these changes happening from 1965, still shortly after the death of President Kennedy, to 73 and so forth. So think about the big picture of what's happening at this time and why these acts are going on. And I emphasize this because that's going to help you when you are, maybe you're getting stuck like, okay, what was the 504 again? Okay, maybe, well, I remember they did an institutionalization. I remember shortly after they were making an act for laws. I know that it's either going to be this one here or this one here. So I have a 50-50 chance, but it could just help you get a kind of key and timeline to bigger picture. Now, the next big one was the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1990 and also the American with Disability Act of 1990. Who here has, starts the ones that were here in January, who here has ever heard of the term the capital crawl? You can either raise your hands, you can type in the chat box, you can say yes or no, it's okay. Anybody remember something called the Capitol Crawl of 1990? Well, time to watch another education video. Because this did happen, this was recent, and it's still applicable today. And I'll share with you some more here shortly. So let me go ahead and open up the screen here, skip verification, and we are gonna go. We are gonna go here and do this. And let me go ahead and stop sharing my camera. I'm gonna go ahead and share screen, share sound. Please watch this video.
I remember when we were trying to get the ADA passed, and I need to climb the steps. I want to climb the steps, and Wade said, "Go for it." So I got out of my wheelchair and I started climbing. Well, the next thing I know, I've got 50 cameras on me, and I've got mics all over me, and it's like the hottest day. You know, the month of March, and I'm just, I'll take all night if I have to. And I'm like, you know, I'm like 8, 9 years old, and I'm going, water, 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 I need water. And you know, I've got the little pamphlet in the back of my pocket that we're supposed to hand over to the politicians to get the ADA passed, and they say that that it was the image of me climbing those steps that you know, was the final decision to get the ADA passed. And I mean, I had to do it.
Wow.
We can't hear you. Your mic's not on.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So thank you. I think John knew what I was saying. I'm going to get opportunity to get off the mic here real quick, but I want to hear from the audience. What are your thoughts and perceptions on this?
Definitely some determination there.
What else? I'm going to start calling names here. Cassidy, what was your impression of this?
Well, she was motivated to get the laws changed. It was for the better good. That's how I look at it.
Definitely. What about who was president at that time in 1990? This is to my older audience.
If I was not mistaken, it probably was President Bush, the first, but I don't know.
Yeah, President Bush Sr. And what was going on between 1990 to 1992? It was a big thing that was happening. There was a war in a place that we went back in 2003. Who ever heard of the Gulf War?
Oh yeah.
Desert Storm, Desert Shield, right? So George Bush Sr. was president at the time. And prior to that, there was no ADA Act, and it was sitting on Capitol Hill being pushed to the side. And I'm not saying this in the sake of politics. I'm putting the bigger picture in here. At the same time, when did the Gulf War start? Gulf War started in around 1990 to 1991. So you have the Gulf War going on. You have the president dealing with this here. You have this capital car going on to get the ADA Act established. And it takes a young girl on a wheelchair to have eyes on Capitol Hill, or Capitol Hill have eyes on her to push something to change it. Going through the regular legislation did nothing. They were tabling it. That's why it was such a huge impact when they enforced the laws. And so I wanted you to listen to that, because we still need changes today. This may have happened in 1990 and 1992, but there's still things that are happening today. And we're probably going to see another change soon, another legislative act. But what is it going to take? For people with disabilities, it takes a lot more than just going to a lobby and trying to do a protest. It takes a lot of courage, like this little girl, to try to have something changed and pushed. So as you're servicing these people with disabilities, keep in mind what it takes to get several of these laws pushed. You know, forgive me for equating this, but I also equate this to like the Civil Rights Act. If we go back to, let's say, let's see, where are we at? This Rehabilitation Act of 1965. When was Civil Rights Act? When? Let me go over here. When Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. A year later, the Vocational Rehabilitation Act kicks off in 1965, not that long ago. And it took a big, huge change in the nation to make those things happen. Okay, so I'm just, again, I'm trying to reinforce here that not only does it take special people to do this, you know, unique things to do that, but these things didn't just come easy. It took a lot of strain. It took a lot of pressure. And she wasn't the only one at the Capitol Crawl. There was a lot of people that set up there to do the Capitol Crawl. And if you understand people who are on wheelchairs, they have, depending on the level of injury of their spine, whether it's complete or incomplete, they may have respiratory issues too. They have chronic health issues. And so for this young little girl at this age to do this and to step right there and actually go through this says a lot. And so with that, as you're studying these acts, again, I'm gonna push in your head, think of the bigger picture, what's happening. This way, when you see those questions and they're asking you about 1990, I remember something about a capital crawl. Oh, I remember now. There was the titles 1 through 4. What did they entail? The employment, public services, accommodations, telecommunications, and miscellaneous. And there's even a council that oversees these titles are being enforced. So when you study for this, in addition to studying the Vocational Rehab Act of 1973, make sure you know the titles of the Disability ADA Act of 1990. Okay. And you can use the capital crawl as a memory reference to think about that. So my next question for you is here. What's the difference between the Vocational Rehab Act sections 501 through 4 and the American Disability Acts titles 1 through 4? Anybody like to take a shot? How about you, Tanya? Oh, I guess Tanya Black's not here. Shakisha, are you here?
I'm here.
Ah, cool. So what do you think is the difference between the Vocational Rehab Act of 1973, sections 501 through 4 versus the American with Disabilities Act?
I think the problem, I don't know if something different between being added and the 504 was amended, some amendments that added to that section, right?
Okay. So you're saying that these here were just amendments added to this 1973, and this here is rights protected.
Yeah.
Right. So basically, that's one way to think about it. These were amendments added to it, talking about the stuff that would if later on become rights. That's one way to think about it. So I would encourage you to spend some time making sure that you understand the difference between the two. So if you do see a question come up saying, according, and then you will probably see this question, according to the American Disabilities Act of 1990, Section 504 states, you can say, wait a minute, there is no ADA Act Section 504. That's the Vocational Rehab Act of 1973. So in your studies, it's okay, Tanya, make sure that you distinguish between the two because they do sound very similar. Think about it this way. We have employment, public service, public accommodations, telecommunications, and miscellaneous. Well, the Section 504 also has equal opportunities, access to standard, and federal hiring and federal contract. So they're different, but you can easily mix them up. You would think that the equal opportunities was related to the ADAs, but it's not. That's equal opportunities in employment. So you can also think of this as this is specifically talking about federal buildings and federal installations. ADA is like a Civil Rights Act. So make sure when you're studying this, you know the difference between the two, so you don't get stumped on a question that comes up because there might be 1 or 2 questions that will come up on it. So, all right. With that, we do have several other acts that came out later. We have the Rehabilitation Act of 1992. Well, before I go, does anybody else have any questions or thoughts about that strategy? No? Okay. So with that, Rehabilitation Act of 1992 is just, again, we're talking about informed choices at individual agency level. So people have an informed choice to make the decision what they want for their care. This here also establishes qualified personnel. as far as people who are certified in rehabilitation counseling or those who are certified to assist people with disabilities. So that has a big factor on us when we work in this field of work and we're hired for these roles. Okay. Emphasis on university and counselor certification. With that, in continuing, these are just, think of these like amendments for 92. They're just amendments. They're just additional stuff. But with that though, is when we talk about, when we remember we talked about the most people with the most severe disabilities, there's a 60-day window. That's what this act came up for, is that they have 60 days to make a determination, because you don't want to have somebody waiting 90 days. Okay. But there's a lot more to it. You can definitely read about it. I didn't see many questions on that too much. I don't think I saw any questions for this there, but it's not to say that wouldn't come up. So I would encourage you, read about the Rehab Act of 1992. Also, I want to mention something here, which I didn't quite mention out here. Do not confuse the IDEA Act with the ADA Act. Okay. One thing I want to mention about the IDEA Act, if you were around my age and we're going to school in the 1990s, you might not remember, but there was a huge push for public institutions or public schools to send kids to a counselor for a psych eval. And with that, if a student was found to have suspected disabilities, they would be given Ritalin, Adderall for ADD, ADHD. You started hearing that coming out. Well, that's because of this, that they use that. Because, and I'm not trying to put this in a bad light, but I'm just putting it as a factor from my own experience personally. The more federal funding that a school gets, the better the school can do. And one way to get federal funding was through this, to provide students with disabilities, so special education and so forth. So with that, since 1990 and today, that's why some parents, if they're looking at your children, they're wondering, like, what, is he not behaving right? Does he have ADHD? Does he have that? If they suspect a child disability, they want to get him evaluated to get him treated ahead of time. So like that, when they become older, they're supposed to have a successful outcome. Do all schools do that and provide it? Maybe not, but that's the idea behind the IDEA Act. So just make sure you know the difference between this one and this one too. With that, we also have what's called the School to Work Opportunities in 1994. This is providing grants for school to work systems for state and local agencies, basically helping those agencies hire people with disabilities is the idea behind that. With that too, you probably heard of this WIOA, but before that, it was called the Workforce Investment Act of 1998. This was the prequel to the WIOA, which we'll talk about shortly. And what this did is that this links state and federal VR programs to states' workforce investment system, consolidated employment and training programs statewide to workforce with customers, easy access to employment information and services through a one-stop center. Who here has not heard of an American Job Center or Career One Stop? If you've gone to your local workforce development center, you have probably gone to an American Job Center. If you talk with somebody who does food stamps and right next to them is somebody who does childcare services and then somebody who does employment services, that's a one-stop center. That's an American Job Center. It's because of this here where vocational rehab services for the state are also, like the Texas Workforce Commission, for example, are partnered with these one-stop centers. That's why vocational rehab counselors are integrated with workforce development centers because of the WIA Act. So think of this as like the prequel of a one-stop center or career one-stop / American Job Center. And I'll encourage you to Google it if you don't know what they are. They're very useful because if you have somebody who are looking for jobs, especially those disabilities, you can refer them to them. Now, there were amendment acts of 1998, which in this here, you could get asked a potential question because I know that the federal VA or Veterans Readiness Employment still call it the IWRP, but it's really now should be called the Individual Plan of Employment or IEP. Okay. Basically, it's a big service plan that's supposed to help identify the person, who they are, what their skills and aptitudes are, what are the barriers to employment, what are the strategies that you're gonna helped him get around it? What additional education and training are going to need to help them achieve their goals? It's designed as a tool, kind of like I call it like a screener tool to kind of help you identify what's going to stop them from doing the work and what can you do around it. That's what I do right now with my job as a career navigator. And I do it with people with or without disabilities, but just FYI. Not only that, it also establishes the automatic eligibility for people who are already receiving SSI or SSDI to benefit for VR services. Later on in the lectures, and if you look at some of the slides, a person who is receiving SSI benefits or SSDI benefits automatically qualify for vocational rehab services. That's why in a lot of agencies, you want to make sure that you know how SSI or Social Security works, because you could get a lot of clients from there. Okay. Introduce a new category of services, technical assistance and consultation for individuals pursuing self-employment, telecommuting, or small business. If you go back to the previous slides, there was something that I talked about individuals with blindness that have a law passed to allow them to vend or sell services on a federal installation. That's their private business. That sounds very related. Make sure you figure out what that act is. With that, outreach to minority to schools to return to work, and of course, get them to find jobs, and establishing a mediation policies and procedures to improve due process. I want to say this is talking about workmen's compensation, but do not quote me. If somebody here is an expert workers' compensation, feel free to correct me after what I just said. I don't mind. Now, moving forward here, again, this is a lot of it's just cut dry, kind of straight to the point. Ticket to Work Investment Program 1999, you might get asked this. I think I saw a question similar to this. But keep in mind, it is available to people to do this, but you need to know how this works specifically, because the way it could be worded in the question could be, when a person is receiving Social Security benefits, but they also want an opportunity to work so they can get out of the service, is called what? And so you might need to know that. There was the Amendment Act, or the Ideas Act of 2004, which was, this is related to schools and educations, and they're required to report the progress of students with disabilities and standardized testing. Okay. I want to go back a couple of slides here a little bit and chime in on the IDEA Act of 1990. Where are you? This also was supposed to remove, thank you, Tanya, you got it, the Randolph-Shepard Act. Great. This also was supposed to remove the idea of putting kids in a special education class. Was supposed to. But is that factual? Depends on where you're working at and what state you're in. But it's supposed to allow students, regardless of their disabilities, to be able to sit and learn with students who are not disabled. Also, during this time too, we're seeing the DSM manuals being revised. So in 2008, you have the DSM-4. If you're not tracking, there you go. Now, correct, inclusive education, you got it. With that, you know that the DSM-4 is no longer in use. We have now the DSM-5-TR. So my recommendation is, if you see questions about chronic illnesses and disability, be aware that in the DSM-5-TR, the word term Asperger's does no longer exist. It's now part of the spectrum of autism. LGBTQIA is no longer considered a disability. It's kind of a culture. It's more of a multicultural thing, and so forth. So make sure that even though this law is talking about DSM-4, more than likely when you start getting to chronic illnesses, disabilities, make sure you follow the DSM-5. Now, the most recent changes that has happened for majority, I would say, of United States Americans, and of course people with disabilities, is the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act of 2014. My program that I work at right now works with EOA, so I work with adult and dislocated workers, but they also have it for VR services. And the key thing to remember here about the WIOA is VR agencies must set aside 15% of funding for students with disabilities. These are your transitional youth. So if you have a child or a student that's going to school, they are turning 17 and they want to go to 18, and they're going to 18, but they're not too sure if they want to go to school or to train, send them to your American Job Center or your Workforce Development Center, VR, and ask them about WIOA. Because they'll have the funds to be able to help transition youth get good job skills and place them. That's what that's designed for on the VR side. State side, it's the same thing, but with extra money, of course, to help people who are underprivileged and are underrepresented or minorities, if they were recently laid off due to no fault of their own, if they've been long-term unemployed, or they're receiving terms of layoff, they could potentially also qualify for WIOA services as well. So make sure you know about it, because that's a good tool. So if you're like, man, what am I doing to want to help this child get a job? Well, see if they have this program. And if they do, hey, send them to it. Could be benefit. With that too, we talk about the labor market analysts like DOT, or now we call it ONET, employer engagement and customized training. So, and it does help. With that, for VR services, they follow up with their clients for 90 days or longer. So, okay, project search, we use that with our project search program. Yep. So different states call it different things. So I've heard of project search before. So but there's just different things. It just depends on which agency has the funds. And if that agency or the local board, I know these for Texas, if the local board obtain funds for it, they'll use it. So, but again, follow services are for 90 days or longer. And of course, the National Institute of Disability, remember that we talked about that? I think it was back in 1954, went from the Department of Education to Department of Health and Human Services. So if you're looking for a field in Department of Health and Human Services, VR is also needed in that role too. We're needed everywhere. So now, what about, who here remembers about the whole big spiel about the Affordable Health Care Act Amendment of 2017 and 2018? AKA Obamacare. I'm going to show you a video, and this did happen, but it wasn't well publicized. This was around the time when President Obama was no longer in. I want to say President Trump was now in charge, but yeah, was in charge. And with that, they were doing cutbacks to the Affordable Care Act, because the idea behind it was everybody should have access to health care. And with that, Social Security benefits were supposed to be protected more for people with disabilities. So this didn't happen not too long ago. This was very recent. And this is going to be something that we're probably going to see more changes of in the next few coming years. Oh, look, there it is. Disability rights. And I'm going to go ahead and mute my mic, share my screen, and let you watch the video.
No cuts to Medicaid. Save our liberty. 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 No cuts to Medicaid. Save our liberty.
Does anybody ever remember seeing that on national television? It wasn't well advertised. It really wasn't, but this happened. And this is the most latest in the change for disability rights. So when you hear people talking about, oh yeah, no, we need to cut back on Social Security, we got people back to work and everything else, keep in mind, you know, there's always a two-part to the story. And so if you're coming into the field of vocational rehab, yeah, you're going to be working for the state, we're working for federal, but you also got to understand what's happening around you because things will change. And depending on what comes out, usually federal first and state next, that's what we're going to be enforcing and go through. So as you're planning to study for your CRC exam and continue working with people with disabilities, keep in mind it's still an ongoing process. A lot of stuff is not equally and has not changed. So with that, if you want to know more about what's happening in the news and stuff with disability rights and everything else, and again, this also includes mental health. This also includes people with schizophrenia, diabetes, everything. Keep in mind, our successors, the Gen Xers and baby boomers, are going to be the next few people we're going to be servicing. Because guess what? 73 million people. I could be wrong. Somebody fix me on my numbers. I could be wrong here. Over 70 million baby boomers now are at that retirement age and they're disabled. And a lot of them are realizing I might need to get back to work and I can't afford the health care. I can't afford to help them. So guess what's going to happen? A lot of them are going to come for VR services. And maybe you're seeing them now, but that's going to be a big emerging field where they're going to likely need counselors to work in. So there's just things to think about that as you're studying to try to get the certification. This isn't just a certification. You're trying to say I'm a professional to help people with various disabilities. With that, I don't know if you can see this though, but this is called the Disability Scoop, and it lets you know about upcoming laws and changes and things that's happening with people with disabilities and acts. I don't know if you saw it though, but Disney is doing a new initiative now, and I just saw like just now where for some of their old movies, they now have an ASL interpreter that are going to be interpreting for the movies. So like that, people who are deaf or hard of hearing can now understand what's happening in the movie better, in addition to closed captioning. So that's pretty cool. Disney right now is a big proponent of disability rights, and they're improving on it. So with that being mentioned, I'm not going to show the TED Talk. I'll upload that later so you can watch it. But make sure you remember who Judith Human is, at least. That's just for yourself. But make sure you do know what you're quite getting into, okay? Yep. So with that, there's also the section that I didn't want to talk too much about, and that's the Code of Ethics. So if in the red book, which I'm about to pop up here right now, let me go ahead and pop that up.
Kennedy, is that okay if I say something quickly?
Please chime in. This is an open forum.
Before you play the TikTok video, do you mind going back to the last slide before you played the video? Yes, there it is.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just pause for a sec?
Yeah. And by the way, if you need this, I will send you copies of these. So you will get a copy of this. It'll be uploaded in a shared drive so you have access to this so you don't lose it. But no, you're more than welcome to take screenshots, take notes. This is for you all.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. But with that, let me go ahead and get to Springer. I would encourage you on your time between now and Sunday. I pretty much touched through the acts, okay? I feel like the acts were very important just to kind of chime on it. Some people that told me the CRC, they saw a question risk. Some people said they didn't. I would say chances are you're going to see at least 1 to 2 questions, maybe 3 from the act. But when you start putting things in a bigger picture and we start going into things like the counseling theories and stuff like that, you can use that as a way to memorize not only the material we talked about now, but the more current stuff that we'll be talking about soon. So this is the red book that I have on digits, and I love it on digits because it's amazing. Because I can go to any section I want. It's a quick, fast reference. I like my technology. Okay. Wake up. So in here, professional orientation and ethical practices. They have mock examination questions you can use. And what I like about this is that there's a table that makes this simplified. And you can use the table to help you. Okay, so however you study it, they have it broken down here for you. What they might not have though is the titles. So you want to make sure you probably Google or use the slides to help you with the titles, and then this here, of course, it has that there. So that's going to help you. What I do encourage you to do too, this is another way you can study it, is when we start talking about, well, what you'll need to read about is, keep going, is the ethics and principles. And the reason why I'm not touching on this here is because this, where is it? Oh. Okay, that's the philosophical issues, professional identity. These are things that if you went through school for your master's program for, whether you were doing mental health counseling or rehabilitation counseling, these kind of merge together. We're both CAC rep certified, and we have to follow a code of ethics, whether it's the ACA code of ethics, or the CRC code of ethics. Okay. Those things you should pretty much know by now. If you've been working in the field or not, have at least by this time should have your practicum and internship done. And that's why I'm not going to touch on this, because you should know most of these things. Maybe you want to look at this term right here. You might see that on the CRC exam. The ethical principles as far as autonomy, beneficence, fidelity, justice, non-maleficence, veracity. Just remember being honest, do no harm, do good to others, be faithful, fair, and respect the rights of individuals. I didn't see anything this year, but that to say that couldn't come up there later, but those are things you would have to read on your own to do. Okay. With that, according to the CRC Code of Ethics, keep in mind, wherever agency you're at, they have their own form of certain work ethics, but this here is according to the standard, what the CRC wants. So make sure you differentiate between the two and read those. And then if you get the one online, let's say you did a multiple choice answer, like the first piece of federal legislation enacted to support the practice of vocational rehab, well, we know was what? So just Rehab Act, right? And it can tell you that. If not, if you have the book, it has the answer in the end. And of course, you have your resources. Any thoughts, questions, perceptions, anything that we discussed about at the moment? Good night, Emily. With that, I'm going to ask the audience here, just tell me before we wrap up for tonight, what was one thing you got out of tonight's lecture? You can write it in the group chat box, or you can talk here in person. What was one
I
thing you
can
got?
go.
Go for it.
I like the first video that you showed us, the little girl fighting for her rights. And that was just really inspiring to me. I've never seen that video or even heard of it. So that was something I took it from this class.
Good. So the ADA rights, in the capital cross. Good. How about somebody else? Thank you.
I'm sorry, but I have to agree with her. I am really at awe that it took all of that just to have a law pass. It took for that baby to climb up them steps. And I feel bad because I've never seen that video, never even heard of it. So yeah, that was interesting.
Definitely. So with that being mentioned, as we go through this, and as you learn these things, I put these in here so it can help you remember better and gives you a little more better meaning as far as what you're really trying to earn. And that's why it's not an easy certification, because you're representing what all has happened to get to where our what vocational rehab is today. So like me, when I got my CRC, I mean, I take it with great pride, because it's not an easy thing. It's not an easy test. And I'm not coming here to say that everybody here is going to pass it. That's my hope. But the thing is, what you put into what you get out of it. But with that, you're getting it for something a little bit bigger than just a piece of paper to get a job position. So, okay. So before I wrap up and call it a night, though, I'm going to send an email out, because I would like somebody to help me on the next lecture. And I do this because I feel the best way to learn is by teaching. Even if you don't know it, the best way is to learn by teaching, because you're going to remember what you're sharing with others, a lot easier than when you're just getting stuff that's regurgitated on a one-way conversation like I'm doing right now. Okay, just a way of learnability. So I'll send an email out, but I'm going to ask for somebody, at least 1 to 2 people to help me teach next week's lecture, which is going to be the evidence-based practices and the where is it? Let me double check the book. It's going to be the evidence-based practices and counseling theories and techniques, because it's 2-part. One, we're going to talk about the evidence-based practices, why we use what we use for our therapies, which a lot of you mental health counselors should know these things, maybe specialize in one of those areas. And then the other half is going to be talking about those theories. Okay. With that, that's all I pretty much have here for tonight's first lecture. I'm going to open up again on Sunday. Even though it's Easter, in case people want to come and study, but if you don't want to come and study due to the holiday and everything else, I understand. I respect that. But thank you all for coming tonight. I will send out a follow-up email here shortly. I'm going to stop the recording here right now. And you have yourself a wonderful day. And I'll see you all hopefully Sunday. If not, definitely Thursday.